Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Wilton Littlechild. He acquired his law degree from the University of Alberta in 1976. He's the first treaty Indian in Alberta to graduate with a law degree and the first treaty Indian elected to the Canadian Parliament. He graduated in 1967 with a bachelor's in physical education. In 1975, he took a master's degree in physical education. In all of Willie's endeavors, Mr. Littlechild has exhibited commitment to excellence. As an athlete, he won more than 70 provincial, regional, national, and international championships. Also, as a coach and organizer of sports events, he was inducted into 7 Sport Walls Hall of Fame. He was the founder of the North American Indigenous Games and is currently working on the World Indigenous Nations Games. Recently, he was the recipient of both Alberta and Saskatchewan Centennial Medals. As parliamentarian from 1988 to 1993, Dr. Littlechild served on several senior committees in the House of Commons and was a parliamentary delegate to the United Nations. At the international level, he organized coalitions of indigenous nations that sought and gained consultative status with the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. He was reappointed to a second term by the ECOSOC President to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples to represent North America. In 1999, Dr. Littlechild's many accomplishments was recognized when he was awarded the Order of Canada and the World Fay d'Excellence Laureate for Sports, 1999 and 2000 in Geneva, Switzerland. He has served as chairperson for the Saskatchewan Justice Commission, awarded the Queen's Counsel and Indigenous Peoples Council by the legal profession in Canada, which I might add are two of the highest honors I believe that you can obtain as a barrister, solicitor, lawyer / in Canada. In light of international awards, he's won the American Medal of Honor in 2003, the International Medal of Honor for Law and Sports. He's been inducted into the Order of International Ambassadors and inducted as one of the 2,000 Outstanding Intellectuals of the 21st Century. He's been appointed as Honorary Chief with the Meskwaki Cree and International Chief for Treaty 6 and has been elected as Regional Chief for Alberta in Canada. He obtained the Parliamentary Distinguished Service Award as a Member of Parliament in 2006 and currently serves as Commissioner on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which is a court-mandated review of the Indian residential schools legacy and its impacts in the country of Canada. So without further ado, I want to give you Wilton Littlechild.
Well, good morning, all of you, and thank you very much, my brother Bill, for the introduction. I have a very short version of that. It's Doctor, Lawyer, Indian Chief. When I was a young student, counselors would ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? Would you like to be a doctor, lawyer, or Indian Chief? And I'd say yes. But anyway, thank you very much. It's certainly an honor to be here with all of you this day, and as Bill said, if I may be so informal as to say, Bill, this is a very timely and important symposium to have here today. And I want to thank the University of Tulsa and also the Native Law Center for hosting us on this discussion. So it's great to be here. I thought I might give acknowledgement as well to begin with the traditional owners and caretakers of these territories for welcoming us in here to be able to have this visit and discussion. Certainly an honor for me also to be sharing the podium here with such a distinguished, as Bill said, some great speakers that are going to follow me. I'm just doing the introduction, so they will give you more detailed information as we go about the day. Esteemed law warriors, I'll call them, as for example, Tim Coulter here, he's certainly acknowledged as one of the drafters of the UN Declaration going back in, I don't want to date you there, Tim, but early 70s. And of course, brothers we have within the corridors of the United Nations who made it happen in terms of where we are today. Julian Berger. I'm very honored to be here with him as well. These are friends of mine. Is it okay for me to say friends? Over the years, we've developed a working relationship, I think a very respectful one, if I may add. So it's great to be able to be here with to both of you. And also a third era of new warriors, I'll call young ladies who will be speaking with us today. And I'm really honored that you would take up the interest in a way to carry on the fight that I'm going to talk about in a few moments, because I want to share with you where I started with this work, and then give a very quick overview of where we've been internationally, because it was actually a very great concern of the elders in my community who gathered us in the very early 70s to say to us, you know, we're very, very concerned about how easy our treaties are being violated. Almost on a daily basis, they're being violated. So after many ceremonies, they decided that we should embark on an international activity to bring about respect and recognition. Because that's what the elders told us, and the leaders, the chiefs told us at the end of the ceremonies, to begin this journey in a way. All we want is respect and recognition. That's what the elders told us. Now, when you go into this international arena, here are 4 things that you have to safeguard all the way through in your work. Well, actually, I embarked on this journey thinking it was maybe about 5 years. Well, it's been 33 years now for me on this journey, but it's been certainly a great honor. My traditional name is Mahikan Kmohteo. My English spirit name is Walking Wolf, or Wolf Walker. That's what I said in my language to, first of all, greet you in my language as a chief, with the great honor that I am to be able to be here with you. So it starts with the elders back in 1977 for me, but actually it's these 2 men who began the journey for us, what I will call the first wave. Many of you know and have heard of Chief Deskahe from the Haudenosaunee. He went to the League of Nations in 1923, and then he was followed by Ratana, who was a Maori spiritual leader, in 1925. When they went to bring our concerns to the international arena, they could not gain access to the League of Nations, which is now the United Nations. Fortunately for Chief Deskahe, the city council in Geneva granted him an audience. And this was the beginning, really, of us having a voice internationally. But unfortunately, for a period of time, not much happened since their early journey to the League of Nations. It was not until the 70s when the second era begins. And I want to cover that period in 4 different areas. First of all, at the International Labour Organization, the ILO. And secondly, the United Nations itself. Thirdly, the Organization of American States. And lastly, the other international fora where we have participated. For me, I was having actually a tremendous amount of fun playing ice hockey and baseball at the international level. And one day I got a call in my office from one of our great leaders, international leaders at the time. They said to me, Willie, there's going to be a World Conference of Indigenous Peoples in Sweden, and we're looking for a chairperson, and we'd like you to discuss the ILO Convention 107. But you don't have to answer right away. They said, we'll call you back in a couple of weeks. So they did. They called me back in a couple of weeks. And sure enough, I said, I definitely want to go to Sweden. I don't know about this chairman thing, but what the heck is ILO Convention 107? I didn't know about it. So anyway, they faxed it to me and they said, study it on a plane. So off I went to Sweden. Little did I know that my career from sport was going to immediately stop there and turn towards international law. And I've been at it now since 1977. My first journey to Sweden in 1977. So anyway, I chaired this meeting in Sweden at the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples at their second session in Kiruna, and had studied the ILO Convention 107. But after the convention, they said, well, Willie, now that you've chaired this meeting, why don't you go to Geneva and present it? Geneva. I'd never been there in my life in terms of international sport. So I went. I remember going to the airport, landing at the airport in the middle of the night in Geneva, not knowing a word of French at the time, except for what I learned in boarding school. So I told the cab driver, here's the address of the hotel and here's some money. So take me. So he did. He took me. Anyway, I ended up at the hotel I was supposed to be at. And that was 1977. Before that, there had been actually parallel meetings going on. I think when I look back at the time, because I remember my late cousin coming to me and he said, Willie, pack your bags because we're going to Wounded Knee. I said, Ed, I'm doing law exams. I can't go. So off he went to Wounded Knee, and that's when I think Tim became involved with drafting the first statement of principles that led the way for the UN declaration. But for me, it was the ILO convention. So I was asked to take this to Geneva, to meet with the ILO, to ask them to amend the ILO Convention 107. And make a long story short there, in terms of the process, it's much quicker at the ILO to amend the convention. In fact, it's a 2-year process. So we got the ILO convention amended. It was such an outdated document at the time because it was the first and only existing international law instrument in 1957. So 20 years later, it was still there, but it was very assimilationist in its approach. So the delegates at the international conference said, we want this change to be updated. And now we have the ILO Convention 169. And that's a composite in a way of not only labor law, because it talks about education and health and social welfare and so on, land. And it was the first instrument that talks about consent. And I'll come back to that, because when I studied it, the time that I received it, there was not one word in there about treaties. And treaties were the concern that my elders talked about when we first began our journey. But coincidentally, the United Nations was also starting to have meetings. In fact, the first one was held in 1977 in August in Geneva. And I was blessed to be there as a young lawyer to begin my participation at the UN as well. And the distinction, of course, is that the ILO dealt with economic, social, and cultural rights. And we were told when we were amending the convention that we could not talk about civil and political rights like the right to self-determination, because that belonged at the UN. The UN was the proper forum for that discussion. So we went to the UN, and if you recall, some of you, 3 things have happened. One was the ILO discussion. The COBO report had just been worked on and finished, and the establishment of the working group at the United Nations began. And one of the very important parts of the COBO report, well, 2 important parts in my view, and it's very biased in a way, but it's the first time that indigenous peoples are identified. because we've had this struggle ongoing even till today about who are indigenous peoples. And there was a definition that the Cobo report came out with. But he also said that I didn't have enough time to study all of the issues, for example, treaties in the Cobo report. So he recommended that treaties be looked at in his report. So from the 1977 meetings, and here you have a picture of the delegation literally walking into the UN because we didn't have access to the UN. In fact, after ceremonies, the elders led the way with pipes and hooked elbows and literally walked into the UN. From a point of having no voice internationally, I want to quickly jump now to, I think, the tremendous success many peoples have contributed to at the international level. The working group started in 1982, and one of the important tasks it undertook was to draft a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because they had a mandate, two mandates. One was to review current developments, and as part of that, they decided to, after hearing many presentations, to look at drafting a declaration. It's unfortunate in a way because in 1975 you'll see that the Wounded Knee 75 and 76 activities led the way really to a statement of principles being brought forward at the international level. And then in 1985, at the meeting of the working group to discuss the declaration, we made a presentation saying to the delegation, we already have a declaration that comes from indigenous peoples, and you should look at it and start with it in your discussions, and we can help you with it going forward. Unfortunately, they decided not to take that, and they started from scratch, working on the UN Declaration. 1986, the conference was canceled, and a group of us as indigenous delegates said we can't allow the conference not to happen. So we raised money and we rented a room at the UN to make sure that there was an ongoing series of meetings on a declaration. And I had the honor of co-chairing that meeting, and what we did at that meeting was to consolidate the 1975 Statement of Principles with the 1977 World Council of Indigenous Peoples Declaration. And then the meeting had been held in Panama. So there were these three sets of declarations. So in 86, we consolidated them into one. And in 87, we presented that again to the working group and said, we have now one set of principles that have been agreed to at the international level by indigenous peoples. To go back to the elders' ceremonies and the four things they told us about, the very first thing was Oyotamasoin, self-determination. Kikpaktingosoin, that these are inherent rights. Kisoichgeona, treaties. Tepemoin. So, mutual consent, Cree understanding of treaties, that the self-determination is an inherent right. And they said to us in our language, do not ever back away from anyone on those four things. So those were incorporated into the declaration as well, at least in 1987 version. I remember the meeting in Sweden, the very first principle had self-government on it. we stroked it out and we put self-determination. That was the leading principle that we wanted to advance in our work together. So we have the working group. A study was approved by the Commission on Human Rights at the time to look at treaties. This was a 9-year study, as you know, by a special rapporteur, the late Professor Dr. Miguel Alfonso Martinez. And he made some very important conclusions from his study. I remember the first time actually we invited him to come to our community and partake in our ceremonies. And it was after he had sat with elders that he began to understand the importance of a sacred agreement, that it was with spiritual ceremony that it was agreed to. And that was the concern that our elders talked about, that here we have an agreement, what we view as a sacred agreement because of the spiritual ceremony that accompanied the agreement itself, and it was being violated on a daily basis. So the treaty study led into a series of other events. You've heard about the international decades of the world's indigenous peoples, and one of the countries that gets great acknowledgement, and I want to add my congratulations to them. Denmark gets usually the credit for the decades and the eventual permanent forum at the United Nations. But it was actually an indigenous meeting in Mexico. The Indigenous Initiative for Peace had a gathering in Mexico. And it was that meeting that declared a decade on the rights for indigenous peoples. So it started out as an indigenous initiative, and then the UN got on board actually after. That story is not known about a lot in my view, because it was credit given more to the state process. So after more than 30 years of struggle, and I think that many will argue that it was the hunger strike in Geneva during the discussions on the declaration that actually moved some of the states to come on board with supporting the declaration. We have one of the hunger strikers here, if you want to wave your hand there, Andrea. It really had an impact in the UN. In fact, there were a lot of discussion about rules of what you can do and what you couldn't do. One of the rules was you had to leave the building at a certain time, and the strikers said, no, we can't, we have to stay here. And this is not only a hunger strike, it's also a spiritual ceremony in itself. So for me, I want to now go into a personal role I had at the UN because of the original instructions the elders gave us, and that was to work on the treaty part of it. And I point this out in the preamble of the UN Declaration because there's one word in there, kikpaktingosoin is what they told us, that these rights are inherent rights. And the Declaration acknowledges that in the preambular paragraph. Also that for us, it's very important that these treaties should be viewed as solutions and not as problems. They represent, after all, as the preambular paragraph says, the basis for a strengthened partnership between indigenous peoples and states. So they have been mischaracterized, in my view, over the years, largely with the help of media, if I can say it that way. We had the honor, as I say, to co-chair this part of the declaration meetings. And it was really interesting. I think Julian will remember that once the declaration meetings were finished at the working group, we went into another working group called the Intersessional Working Group. And at that meeting, at the very first meeting, I raised my hand and I said to the chair, I'd like to propose that we have an indigenous co-chair to chair this meeting of the United Nations. It interrupted the meeting for 3 hours because they said, oh no, we have to get a legal opinion from New York. And the time zone difference was, not quite, wasn't really helpful. I thought it was to my advantage, but anyway, they said, no, we have to get a legal opinion. So legal opinion came back and said, no, you cannot have an indigenous co-chair. So we let it go for that point. And I say that in a way that to link it with the original journey, 1923, of the Chief Deskahe and Ratana in 1925, having no voice. So we couldn't co-chair a meeting, but we went ahead with the declaration. And one of the other very important parts of the treaty position that the elders presented to us was that these are international agreements or international agreements, if I can say it that way, because we had existing treaties among ourselves. For example, in my community, there's a Musqueam, which is Bear Hills. There's a part of the territory where a treaty was made between the Cree Nation and the Blackfoot Nation. Wetaskiwin. It's called Wetaskiwin, which is the Hills of Peace, where we as the Cree Nation and the Blackfoot Nation agreed to stop fighting, to have peace. So in the Peace Hills area, Wetaskiwin is very significant for us. So it's not only an international agreement as we understand it in law sometimes, but international agreement between us as indigenous nations having treaties. We have existing treaties, for example, with our eastern brothers in Canada. So we have the honor of co-chairing now the Article 37 that went into the Declaration on Treaties. And the other co-chair was actually Canada. So I thought, well, Canada is going to be supportive of the Declaration because they've been participating all along, every single meeting. They've co-chaired with me on the treaty articles, the paragraphs in the preambular, all of the whole discussion. But when it came to a vote, if you remember, they voted against it. And I remember walking out of the UN in New York and the media was there and they asked me, well, what do you think? And I said, well, I feel very, very betrayed as an individual. Because here I sat for years co-chairing this discussion on treaties with a country, Canada, only to find they were going to vote against it. Were they planning all along that they were going to vote against it and this was just a charade or fooling everyone? I really felt awful in a way when Canada voted against it at the UN. Now, a very important part of the principles that I talked about with the elders was consent. And if you look at our 1876 treaty with 1877 adhesions, the underlying part there, and to obtain the consent thereto. The word consent already appeared in our treaty in 1876. So it was important for us at the elders' instruction to make sure that consent is talked about at the United Nations. It's become from a point of mutual consent to now, as you see it in the declaration, free, prior, and informed consent. And this, I can tell you, as recently as last week, is creating a lot of good, positive development and good discussion internationally. And in my case, for example, in the tar sands and oil and gas development discussions, the importance of free, prior, and informed consent. So when I looked at Article 37 and I see the way we agreed to it, I'm very encouraged that we were able to incorporate what the elders' concerns were in the Declaration in Article 37, that they are actually international character, that there's mutual respect and consent talked about in the Declaration. So from that point going forward, there's also a very important part of the Declaration that talks about conflict resolution. And this is to the third era I want to hand off to, because they're the ones who will be dealing with going forward in terms of bringing better relations among our peoples in the future. So there was celebration on September 13th. I was there, lots of cheers and hugs and crying for, in a way, satisfaction that you accomplished the milestone in a way, but at the same time, tears that we have states like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia who voted against it. And as you know, Australia and New Zealand have reversed their positions, but now it's encouraging that Canada and the US are both reconsidering their position today. I mentioned there's been more than 30 years of struggle, but there's many also who have died now and have had a lot of input into the work, and you'll see some familiar faces from this territory. Philip Deere was one. Bill Wapapa was another. And of course you see Alfonso Martinez, my cousin Ed Bernstick, who had told me that we're going to go to Wounded Knee during my law exams. So lastly, I want to cover very quickly the other international bodies where indigenous peoples are participating, and I'll go very quickly with this because it's the World Trade Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization, the OAS, and Tim, I'm sure will talk about that because he's very involved in that arena. Convention on Biological Diversity. Just as I landed last night, I got an email that we were successful in advancing 2 arguments at the Convention on Biological Diversity discussions that are happening on the right to participate at these meetings as indigenous peoples. There are many treaty monitoring bodies that are being utilized on an increasing basis by indigenous peoples. The Convention on the Rights of the Child. Let me just talk about 2 of them briefly. The World Health Organization, for example, had the first summit ever on the status of indigenous health. And there is a declaration called the Geneva Declaration that was adopted at the meeting by the World Health Organization. And they've continued to be involved through an organization called the Interagency Support Group, which I think Eugene is a different person. Julian had a hand in actually organizing and shaping it at the beginning stages to get these organizations together into a support group. So I want to thank you, Julian, for your tremendous contribution in that. So the World Health Organization continues to be involved now as a result of the Interagency Support Group and the Geneva Declaration on Health, to a point where now tuberculosis, for example, is a very focal point, WHO for indigenous health concern. You heard the Secretary General in the last speech for the International Day indicate that the global rates are tragic in a sense that in some areas of the world where indigenous peoples live, it's 600 times their national average tuberculosis. So it's come back. We thought we had it licked at one point, but it's back. In Canada, among the First Nations, it's 33 times the national average. In the north, the Inuit people, it's 90 times the national average. It's a second strain of tuberculosis which is resistant to drugs. And it's really a combination of poverty and poor drinking water, poor housing. It's contributing to this resurgence of tuberculosis in our community. The Convention on Rights of the Child, I want to quickly focus on that to tell you a story about the time we had a meeting at the Permanent Forum, and we said we should call on a Committee on the Rights of the Child to have a special day on Indigenous children, and we named the year. So we off went the recommendation up through the Economic Social Council, and it came back down, and the committee met on it and said, yes, we will have a special day, but it'll be this year. So sometimes you heard the expression, be careful what you wish for. So here we're sitting at the UN and Permanent Forum. They're saying, who's going to go to this Convention on the Rights of the Child? They looked around. Oh, there's only one little child in here, so you go. It was like 1977, right? Since you chaired this meeting, you go to Geneva. Well, here I went to the Committee on Rights of the Child and gave the presentation. And the outcome of that actually, not to try to take any credit for it, but the very important outcome of that is the General Comment number 11 that was issued last year by the Committee on Rights of the Child. So every state that's a signatory to the convention, and it's just about all of them, I think there's only 2 of them that have not signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. By the way, the Convention on the Rights of the Child took 27 years to do. We were only in the last 7 years of it, and you'll see that there are 3 articles specifically that reference Indigenous children in the convention. But you would have thought, surely to goodness everyone is in favor of children having rights, right? Well, it took 27 years to do that. Well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples took 25 years. Surely to goodness you would have thought Indigenous peoples have inherent rights like everybody else, right? Well, where there's political will, things can happen, but in this case there's been some tremendous resistance. So now we have a General Comment number 11, so that every state who's a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, when they assess their obligations under that convention, they have to refer to the General Comment number 11, because it focuses on what the convention means as it applies to Indigenous children. So that was a very important contribution the Permanent Forum made, I thought, to the development at the international level. My favorite, you won't get away with this because I have to mention the games. The discussion we had at the UN Declaration, Article 31 actually talks about traditional games and sports. And recently we had an incident. By the way, I got my photo up there because I'm one of the ambassadors for the Olympic Games that were just held in Canada, the Winter Games. And I was also the first torchbearer announced as an Olympic torch runner. And I said something to the media when they interviewed me, asked me about what I felt. I said, it's really a mixed emotion, a tremendous honor to be picked as an Olympic torchbearer. But my dream would be to be able to give that torch, the flame of hope, to a young person, an Indigenous youth. Because this was a cross-Canada competition, and I didn't know, of course, that it was printed in the national newspapers anyway, but they had organized it in a way that I would be able to actually literally give it to a young girl who was the next runner to really accept the challenge of this, a third era of warriors that are coming through now. And in her own way, she's a leader already. Anyway, recently, well, this summer at the last Human Rights Council meeting, something happened I think you might have read about. The lacrosse team was not allowed to compete at the World Championships. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois national lacrosse team. So we jumped into the fray because we had been at the World Forum on Sports. We had been at the World Summit on Physical Education and Sports. We had been all international meetings, including the Olympic Committee meetings, to promote Indigenous athletes in sport, to promote traditional games of our people. It was accepted. It's in a declaration, Article 31. And yet, when our own people can not participate in our own traditional game at the World Championship level, I thought we have to say something about it. It's not the first time it happened. I remember I was at a meeting at the UN and the gentleman touched my shoulder and they said, somebody wants to talk to you outside. So I went outside and there was an elderly couple there. And they said to me, we sang a song in Paris, an opening song, a welcome song, and somebody taped it, and it became the theme song for the Atlanta Olympics. And they said, we don't want money, we don't want royalties, we just want someone to say, we're sorry, we should have asked you if we could use your song. Because I felt that I took the floor immediately after that and I said, this is not only cultural theft, it's spiritual theft. So I went to the IOC, the Olympic Committee meeting in Lausanne, because it's very close to Geneva. And I had a meeting with the president of the Olympic Committee and I said, you know, this is very wrong. When someone can steal our song and sell it to a promotion company in Los Angeles, who sells it to Atlanta and becomes the Olympic theme song. So I remember I was sitting in Spain in a hotel and there's only one channel you can watch. Of course, you all know that, CNN. It's the only English channel. And I heard this song and I said to my wife, Helen, I said, gee, that sounds like one of our songs. Sure enough, it came on again because they were advertising the Olympic Games for Atlanta. Came over again. That is our song, I said. But it wasn't. It was the Ainu people in Japan. It was their song that was stolen. So this goes on, even in sport. I say that because that's the ground I'm most familiar with. But anyway, we went to world conferences as well on human rights, on racism. As a matter of fact, next week there's a meeting on racism to follow up the Durban conference. And sad to say, there will be no indigenous representatives at that meeting, probably. And that was a very important meeting. The women's meeting in Beijing was an important participation at the World Conference. We've had expert seminars in many areas, self-government and autonomy, relationships to land, free, prior, and informed consent, education, administration of justice, health, post-secondary education. But if you look at all of that list, those are all treaty rights. So everywhere we've been, we've tried to raise the issue. Julian, I think you were there one time, I was introduced. And, oh yeah, here he is, Mr. Treaty himself. The guy said, this guy was introducing me from Canada. He was upset with me, I was raising that. Private industry, we've been able to engage them now to come on board and start discussing things like free, prior, and informed consent, how to respect the human rights of indigenous peoples. We've had special rapporteurs. We've approached special rapporteur on health, on education, on housing, on sacred sites, freedom of religion. And now, of course, we have our own special rapporteur, Professor Jim Anaya, who at the last Human Rights Council meeting just a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, was really complimented by many, many states on how important he is contributing to the world in terms of his role as special rapporteur. The right to food, special rapporteur, we're starting to be participating in that level. The studies that were done on cultural heritage, permanent sovereignty of indigenous peoples over natural resources, a study that was done on the definition itself, indigenous peoples, and of course the 9-year study on treaties. Now we have a new body, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we have a permanent site now at the UN set aside for 2 weeks every year where indigenous issues are discussed at the Permanent Forum. Think back now to 1923, to 1977, and where we are today in terms of having a voice directly at the UN. The mandated areas of the permanent forum are 6, and you'll notice that they're economic, social, and cultural rights as a grouping. But we've been able to introduce civil and political rights discussions into that forum as well. And I want to just quickly divert to the Organization of American States, because that's a regional discussions where there have been ongoing negotiations on the rights of indigenous peoples as it applies to the Americas. And as you know, there's 40 million plus indigenous peoples in the Americas. There's a proposed declaration which began with a draft in 1995. Then a Denver text was presented as an indigenous text and became the basis of negotiations across the country. I was one of the 5 people asked to consolidate all the submissions from 25 states and indigenous delegations to come with a consolidated draft of the OAS Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that's still being negotiated. So we then go to the newest body, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I remember when I submitted the proposal on the name, because the name is a big argument about what should we call it. Well, in this case, it's an expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. And that was resisted a lot by states because they didn't want to see the word rights in the title of this new body. Well, I hate to tell you this, but 2 weeks ago at the Human Rights Council, we're right back to square one, where Canada, United States are leading the charge on deleting any reference to the declaration and the resolution, taking off the S on peoples. That was an 8-year debate at the UN. One letter, whether it should be people or peoples. 8 years. Finally, the states agreed it should be peoples. Well, 2 weeks ago, Canada and US think otherwise. And when I ask them why, give me a legally supported argument as to why you take this position. And they say, well, it's collective rights. We don't want to recognize collective rights. They say, well, courts have recognized collective rights. At least in the Supreme Court of Canada, they've recognized collective rights. I'm not sure about the US, but I'm suspicious that they may have recognized collective rights. So it's really disconcerting when you have states come back at the Human Rights Council a couple of weeks ago to take a position that they did. So we still have challenges. We have challenges remaining for the full and effective participation of indigenous people. For example, at the Human Rights Council and the UPR process, which you're embarked on right now with the US, United States is going to be reviewed when November 5th at the Human Rights Council. We went through that with Canada last year. Canada was reviewed at the Human Rights Council. But it's a tremendous challenge to try and participate in that process. So we have challenges that are still there. UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, although there's some good signals in that. By the way, when you look back at all of this, what have indigenous peoples contributed? Well, you had economic and social cultural rights being recognized. You have civil and political rights being recognized. Guess what? There's a 6th bundle of rights that are now being recognized through the OAS Declaration, through the ILO Convention, because it mentions it. Spiritual rights. Spiritual rights are now recognized. And it's indigenous peoples who brought that there. Remember, I was asked to go talk to the chair of a meeting, and I said to her, I've been asked to come with a question, can we open a meeting with an invocation, a prayer in our traditional way? And she said to me, Mr. Littlechild, you know we do not pray at the United Nations. I said, oh, okay, but it's just to offer thanksgiving. I said, finally she agreed that. But now many meetings at the international level at least are opened up with a thanksgiving invocation. So the spiritual way of our life is now been accepted at the international fora. The environment consciousness, the climate change discussions that are going on right now. I remember one of our meetings at the UN, a big room full, all the states, 182 delegations. And one of our elders said, he was asked to address the UN, and he said, go like this. Oops, sorry. Which one of you said is going to talk about my brother, speak for my brother the fish? Which one of you is going to talk about my brother the four-legged? Which one of you is going to talk about my brother the bird that flies, the winged animals? Because you and I are the same in two ways. The water we drink and the air we breathe. Which one of you is going to speak for that? Boy, you could hear a pin drop at that meeting. But I'm sure when I think back about that, that really triggered the consciousness of many people in the States on environmental situations, on climate change and so on. So I think our people have contributed in some way. For example, through the OAS, the family is now recognized. The indigenous family is recognized. Indigenous law is recognized through the OAS declaration. So I think we weren't just there to complain at the UN. We've offered something for humankind as well. So when I look back about recognition, we now have Francisco Cali, who sits at the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Jim Anaya, Special Rapporteur. And I said recently at a meeting, that's not good enough for me. We have young people in the audience here who could be aspiring to, why not a Secretary General of the United Nations be an indigenous person? Why not the High Commissioner for Human Rights be an indigenous person? So we still have a ways to go in a way, but at least now we're getting to have recognition. We have a voice. Thanks to those many people who have worked for these 30 plus years. Let me close with this. Treaties and the UN Declaration are solutions. And I want to quote one of our brothers who spoke at a conference one time in a treaty seminar, and he said, it's like an eagle. Eagle has two wings to fly. On one wing are the treaties, and on the other wing is the UN Declaration. It's going to take both of them together for the eagle to fly. So I thought, what an important statement that is, in a way to recall commitments of states, as the UN Declaration calls on them to do, to promote, respect, and apply the provisions of the UN Declaration. Because it's going to take both of us together, and I say both meaning indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, working together to ensure that implementation of the Declaration happens. So with that, I want to thank you very much again. Thank you very much for sharing very much of your time with me today and this morning. Have a great day. Hi, hi.